The first time Grace Donovan saw her reflection in the cracked mirror of her father's ranch house, she heard the whispers that would follow her for years to come, plain as prairie dust, they said, with a barren womb that would never bear fruit. It was 1876 in the unforgiving territory of Wyoming, and a woman's worth was measured by her beauty and ability to birth children, neither of which Grace believed she possessed. Grace tucked a strand of mousy brown hair behind her ear and straightened her simple calico dress. At 22, she had long accepted the hand fate had dealt her. Her mother had died bringing her into this world, and her father had raised her alongside her 3 older brothers on their modest cattle ranch just outside the growing settlement of Whispering Pines. "Grace," her father's voice called from downstairs. "The Hendersons are here for supper. Make yourself presentable." She sighed, knowing what this meant. Another evening of Martha Henderson parading her beautiful daughters before eligible men while casting pitying glances in Grace's direction. Another night of whispers behind gloved hands about how Thomas Donovan's only daughter would likely die a spinster, unable to give a man the children he deserved. Grace descended the stairs, shoulders back despite the weight of anxiety pressing down on her. The Hendersons had already arrived, along with several other families from town. These monthly gatherings had once been her mother's tradition, which her father continued in her memory. "There she is," Martha Henderson's voice carried across the room. "Grace, dear, you look, well, comfortable." Grace forced a smile. "Thank you for coming, Mrs. Henderson." "Of course," Martha replied, her eyes sweeping critically over Grace's simple attire. "My Beatrice just received a proposal last week from the banker's son, 20 years old and already securing her future. You must be so." She paused, searching for a word that wouldn't sound too cruel. "Focused on helping your father with the ranch." Before Grace could respond, the front door opened, bringing with it a gust of autumn air and the sheriff's booming voice. "Thomas, sorry we're late." "Had to deal with some trouble at the saloon," Sheriff Miller announced, followed by a tall stranger Grace had never seen before. Her father crossed the room to greet them. "No trouble at all. Who's your friend?" "This here's Preston Galloway," the sheriff explained. "New livestock inspector for the territory. Thought he should meet the local ranchers." Grace's eyes were drawn to the newcomer. Preston Galloway stood well over 6 feet tall, with broad shoulders and a lean frame beneath his simple but well-kept clothing. Unlike the dandies from town, he wore practical attire, dusty boots, worn denim, and a plain cotton shirt with a leather vest. His hat was clutched respectfully in his hands, revealing thick dark hair that curled slightly at his collar. But it was his eyes that caught her attention, a clear, steady blue that seemed to take in everything around him with quiet assessment. When those eyes met hers across the room, Grace felt an unfamiliar flutter in her chest. "Miss Donovan," Sheriff Miller said, guiding Preston toward her. "This is Thomas's daughter, Grace." Preston extended a hand rather than offering the customary bow that town gentlemen preferred. "Pleased to meet you, Miss Donovan." His handshake was firm but gentle, calloused from work, yet surprisingly warm. "Welcome to Whispering Pines, Mr. Galloway," Grace replied, finding her voice sounded steadier than she felt. "Preston, please," he said, the corner of his mouth lifting in a small smile. From across the room, Martha Henderson observed the exchange with narrowed eyes. "Mr. Galloway," she called out, "you must come meet my daughters. Elizabeth is quite accomplished on the piano, and Catherine's needlework has won ribbons at the county fair." Preston nodded politely, but didn't immediately move away. "Perhaps in a moment, madam. I was hoping Miss Donovan might tell me about her father's cattle operation. I've heard the Donovan Ranch raises some fine Herefords." Grace blinked in surprise. No one had ever asked her opinion on ranching matters before, despite the fact she kept all the breeding records and had helped deliver more calves than she could count. "Yes, we've been crossbreeding Durham Shorthorns with Herefords for better meat yield while maintaining hardiness for our winters," she found herself explaining. Preston's eyebrows rose with genuine interest. "Smart approach. The territorial agent in Cheyenne mentioned your ranch had lower losses during last year's harsh winter." "Grace has a way with the animals," her father interjected proudly, joining their conversation. "Got more sense about cattle than most men I know." Martha Henderson's tight laugh cut through their discussion. "How unusual for a young woman to concern herself with such matters." Though I suppose when one doesn't have the blessing of children to attend to, one finds other ways to occupy oneself. The room grew uncomfortably quiet. Grace felt heat rise to her cheeks, the familiar shame washing over her. Everyone in town knew about her condition. The doctor had examined her 3 years ago after a bad fall from a horse and proclaimed that her womb was tilted wrong, making childbearing impossible. The news had spread faster than wildfire. I find that capable minds rarely go to waste, Preston said, his voice calm, but carrying an edge that silenced Martha Henderson immediately. And from what I can see, Miss Donovan's contributions to this ranch are invaluable. Grace looked up at him, searching for mockery or pity in his expression and finding neither. Instead, there was only a straightforward appreciation that made her stand a little taller. "Dinner is served," called their housekeeper, Mrs. Fletcher, providing a welcome interruption. As they moved toward the dining room, Preston offered his arm to Grace. "Would you mind sitting near me at dinner? I'd like to hear more about your breeding program." For the first time that evening, Grace's smile came naturally. "I'd be happy to, Mr. Galloway." The dinner conversation flowed more pleasantly than Grace had expected. Preston asked thoughtful questions about the ranch, listening intently to her answers. When Martha Henderson attempted to steer conversation toward her daughter's accomplishments, Preston politely acknowledged them before returning his attention to Grace. "Do you ride, Mr. Galloway?" Grace asked as dessert was being served. "Every day since I was 6, he replied. "My father was a cavalry officer before settling in Colorado. He believed a man who couldn't sit a horse wasn't much use in the West." "Grace rides like she was born in the saddle," her oldest brother James commented. "Puts us all to shame." "I'd love to see that," Preston said with genuine interest. "Perhaps you could join us tomorrow," Grace's father suggested. "We're moving the herd to the north pasture. Could use another experienced hand." "I'd be honored," Preston replied, his eyes meeting Grace's across the table. Later that night, after the guests had departed, Grace stood on the porch, breathing in the cool evening air. The stars stretched across the vast Wyoming sky like diamonds scattered on black velvet. "Miss Donovan?" She turned to find Preston Galloway approaching, hat in hand. "Mr. Galloway, I thought you'd left with the sheriff." "I did, but I realized I'd forgotten to thank you properly for your hospitality." He stepped closer, his tall frame silhouetted against the starlight. "And to apologize." Grace frowned. "Apologize? For what?" "For Mrs. Henderson's rudeness." "You handled it with remarkable grace." He smiled slightly at the unintended pun. "If you'll forgive the expression." "There's nothing to forgive. I'm accustomed to it," Grace replied, looking away. "You shouldn't have to be." His voice was quiet but firm. "Some people measure worth in all the wrong ways." Grace looked up at him, searching his face for any sign of mockery or pity. "And how do you measure it, Mr. Galloway?" "By character, by kindness, by how someone treats others and the land they steward." He gestured toward the ranch spreading out around them. "What you've helped build here says more about you than any gossip ever could." A lump formed in Grace's throat. "You're very kind to say so." "Not kind, just honest." He placed his hat back on his head. "I look forward to riding with you tomorrow, Miss Donovan. Good night." Grace watched him walk away, his tall figure disappearing into the darkness. For the first time in years, she went to bed without the weight of others' judgment pressing quite so heavily on her chest. Morning came with the promise of clear skies and mild temperatures, perfect weather for moving cattle. Grace dressed in her riding clothes, a split skirt she designed herself, a sturdy cotton blouse, and her well-worn boots. She braided her hair tightly and topped it with a wide-brimmed hat to shield her face from the sun. When she entered the barn, she found Preston already there, helping her brothers saddle the horses. "Good morning, Miss Donovan," he called, tipping his hat. "Mr. Galloway," she nodded, trying to ignore the fluttering in her stomach. "I trust you slept well." "Like a rock. The sheriff's spare room isn't fancy, but it's quiet." He watched as she expertly checked her mare's hooves. "That's a fine horse." "This is Willow," Grace said, patting the dappled gray mare's neck. "Raised her from a foal. She's smarter than most people I know." Preston laughed, a warm, rich sound that seemed to fill the barn. "I believe it. Horses generally are." They rode out as the sun was climbing over the eastern hills, bathing the grasslands in golden light. The cattle moved easily, seeming to sense the good weather and fresh pasture ahead. Grace rode confidently alongside the herd, occasionally whistling commands to the cattle dogs that darted among the bovine legs, keeping stragglers in line. Preston worked his way over to ride beside her. "Your father tells me you designed the breeding schedule for the whole herd," he said. Grace nodded. "After my mother died, I started helping with the ledgers. I noticed patterns in which bloodlines produced hardier calves. It became a sort of project, an impressive one. Most ranchers I know could learn a thing or two from your methods." "Most ranchers I know wouldn't listen to a woman," Grace replied, the bitterness slipping into her voice before she could stop it. Preston was quiet for a moment, studying the horizon. "They're lost, then. Stubbornness and pride make poor advisors." They rode in companionable silence for a while, the rhythm of the horses' hooves and the lowing of cattle creating a familiar soundtrack to the morning. "Where did you learn about livestock inspection?" Grace finally asked. "My father raised horses in Colorado. When he died 5 years ago, I took over until the Army bought our stock last year. The territorial governor was looking for men who understood livestock and weren't beholden to any of the big ranching interests." He shrugged. "It seemed like a good fit. Is that what brings you to Whispering Pines?" "Official business." Preston nodded. "There's been trouble with cattle rustling along the territory borders. The governor wants me to assess the situation and help coordinate efforts between local law enforcement and ranchers." "We lost 20 head last spring," Grace said. "Sheriff Miller tried to track them, but the trail went cold at the Montana line." "That's the pattern we're seeing. Sophisticated operation, not just opportunistic thieves." His expression grew serious. "Your father mentioned you keep detailed records. I'd like to look at them if you wouldn't mind. Sometimes the paper trail tells us things the physical one can't." "Of course," Grace agreed. "I have everything documented: birthings, deaths, sales, purchases." A sudden commotion at the back of the herd interrupted their conversation. One of the younger cowboys was shouting, his horse dancing nervously as a group of cattle broke away from the main herd. "Stampede starting." Grace's brother James called out. "Cut them off before they spook the rest." Without hesitation, Grace wheeled Willow around and galloped toward the breaking cattle. Preston was right beside her, his horse responding to his expert guidance. Together they circled wide around the wayward animals, gradually turning them back toward the herd. A young steer, more stubborn than the rest, broke free again. Grace pursued it, Willow anticipating her commands before she gave them. As they approached a rocky outcropping, the steer suddenly changed direction, causing Willow to check her stride. The mare stumbled slightly on the uneven ground, and Grace felt herself losing balance. In an instant, Preston was there, his arm shooting out to steady her, while simultaneously using his horse to block the steer's escape route. The animal, finding itself cornered, reluctantly rejoined its fellows. "Are you all right?" Preston asked, concern evident in his voice. Grace nodded, heart pounding from the near fall. "Yes, thanks to you. Quick reflexes, Mr. Galloway." "Preston," he reminded her, still not removing his hand from her arm. "I think after saving each other from a charging steer, we can dispense with formalities." "Preston," she agreed, suddenly very aware of his touch, even through the fabric of her sleeve. "And you should call me Grace." His smile transformed his face, softening the weathered lines around his eyes. "Grace it is." The rest of the cattle drive proceeded without incident. By mid-afternoon, they had the herd settled in the north pasture, contentedly grazing on the fresh grass. As they rode back to the ranch, Preston kept his horse beside hers, their conversation flowing easily from cattle to territorial politics to books they'd both read. "You've read Thoreau?" Grace asked, surprised. Preston nodded. "My mother was a schoolteacher before marrying my father. Our house was full of books." Walden was her favorite. She said it reminded her that simplicity and nature were the true measures of wealth. "My mother loved poetry," Grace said softly. "She left her books to me. Sometimes I read them aloud at night, just to hear her voice in the words." Preston's expression was gentle. What a beautiful way to keep her memory alive. As they approached the ranch, Grace became aware of a wagon parked in front of the house. "That's Dr. Simmons's buggy," she said, frowning. "I hope no one's ill." They quickened their pace, reaching the yard just as the doctor emerged from the house with Grace's father. "There she is now," Dr. Simmons said, gesturing toward Grace. "Hello, Grace. Your father tells me you had quite a successful drive today." "Yes, doctor," she replied, dismounting. "Is everything all right?" "Oh, yes. I was just dropping off some tonic for your father's arthritis and mentioned that I'd be attending a medical conference in Denver next month. There's a specialist coming from Boston who's done remarkable work with women's conditions." Grace felt her face flush. She didn't need to ask what conditions he was referring to. "I've written to him about your case," Dr. Simmons continued, seemingly oblivious to her discomfort. "He's interested in meeting you. Of course, there are no guarantees, but his methods have helped women previously thought to be barren." "Doctor," her father interrupted, noticing Grace's distress and Preston's presence. "Perhaps we could discuss this later." "No need to be embarrassed, Thomas," the doctor said dismissively. "Everyone knows about Grace's situation. Besides, any man considering courting her would want to know if there's hope for children." Grace wanted the ground to open up and swallow her whole. She couldn't look at Preston, couldn't bear to see the pity or, worse, disgust that would surely be in his eyes now that he'd been so bluntly informed of her defect. "Dr. Simmons." Preston's voice was calm, but carried an unmistakable note of steel. "Medical matters are generally considered private. Perhaps you might extend Miss Donovan the courtesy of discretion." The doctor looked taken aback. "I meant no offense. I only thought—" "That's just it, doctor," Preston interrupted. "Some thoughts are better kept to oneself." An uncomfortable silence fell over the group. Finally, Dr. Simmons cleared his throat. "Well, I should be on my way. Think about the consultation, Grace. It could change everything for you." After the doctor's buggy disappeared down the road, Grace still couldn't bring herself to look at Preston. "I should see to Willow," she said quietly, leading her mare toward the barn. "Grace," Preston called after her, but she quickened her pace, desperate to escape the humiliation burning through her. In the dimness of the barn, Grace buried her face against Willow's neck, fighting back tears. She'd enjoyed Preston's company so much, had dared to think perhaps he might. But now that he knew the truth, whatever interest he might have had would surely vanish. "Grace." His voice came from the barn entrance. "May I come in?" She took a deep breath, composing herself before turning. "Of course. You need to tend to your horse." Preston approached slowly, leading his bay gelding. "I'm sorry about the doctor's lack of tact." "You needn't be," Grace said, focusing intently on unsaddling Willow. As he said, "Everyone already knows. That doesn't make his behavior appropriate." Preston began removing his own horse's tack. "Some people forget that kindness should accompany their medicine." Grace's hands stilled on the saddle blanket. "It doesn't bother you?" "What he said about me?" Preston looked at her directly, his blue eyes serious. "Should it? Most men want children. A woman who can't provide them is—" She trailed off, unable to finish. "Is what?" he prompted gently. Grace swallowed hard. "Incomplete. Less valuable." Preston set down his saddle and moved closer, close enough that she could see the flecks of gray in his blue eyes. "Grace Donovan, in the short time I've known you, I've seen you manage a ranch, handle a herd, command respect from cowboys twice your size, and demonstrate more horse sense than most men I've met in my life. There is nothing incomplete about you." Grace stared at him, searching for any sign of insincerity and finding none. "You can't mean that." "I don't say things I don't mean," he replied simply. "A person's worth isn't measured by what their body can or cannot do. The world doesn't see it that way. Then the world is wrong." He reached out hesitantly, as if afraid she might bolt, and gently took her hand. "And for what it's worth, that doctor doesn't know everything. Medicine advances every day, but even if nothing changes, you are enough, exactly as you are." Grace felt something shift inside her, like a door long locked suddenly opening to let in light. Before she could respond, her father's voice called from outside the barn. "Grace? Preston? Supper will be ready soon." Preston squeezed her hand once before releasing it. "We should go in. But this conversation isn't finished, if you're willing to continue it another time." Grace nodded, not trusting her voice. As they walked side by side toward the house, she felt lighter somehow, as if Preston's words had lifted a burden she'd carried so long she'd forgotten what it felt like to stand straight. The next week passed in a flurry of activity. Preston divided his time between working with Sheriff Miller on the rustling investigation and helping at the Donovan ranch. Each evening, he would join them for supper, and afterward, he and Grace would often sit on the porch, talking until the stars were thick in the sky. Grace learned that Preston was 30 years old, had fought briefly in the latter days of the Civil War as a very young man, and had a younger sister living in Denver with her husband and children. He spoke of his dreams to someday have his own horse ranch, smaller than his father's had been, but focused on quality stock. In turn, she told him about her mother's death when she was just hours old, how she'd grown up surrounded by men who taught her to ride and rope and shoot alongside more traditional womanly skills. She confessed her love of books, her secret passion for sketching the landscapes and animals of Wyoming, and her frustration with the narrow expectations placed on women. One evening, as they sat watching a spectacular sunset paint the western sky in shades of orange and purple, Preston asked about her diagnosis. "You don't have to tell me," he added quickly. "It's entirely your business." Grace was quiet for a long moment. "I fell from a horse when I was 19, she finally said. "It was a bad fall. I landed on some rocks. There was bleeding. Dr. Simmons examined me and said my womb was tilted wrong, likely from the fall, and that it would make conceiving impossible." Preston nodded thoughtfully. "And he's the only doctor who's examined you?" "The only one within 100 miles, Grace confirmed. "Why? I'm no medical man, but I've seen enough horse breeding to know that fertility isn't always as straightforward as doctors sometimes make it seem." He glanced at her. "Would you consider seeing this specialist in Denver?" Grace sighed. "I don't know. I've made my peace with it. Opening that door again seems frightening." "I understand," Preston said gently. "Just know that whatever you decide, it doesn't change your value as a person." They fell into comfortable silence, watching as the first stars appeared in the darkening sky. "I have to go to Cheyenne next week," Preston said finally. "The governor wants a report on the rustling situation." "Oh." Grace tried not to let her disappointment show. "How long will you be gone?" "A week, maybe 2. He turned to face her. "I'd like to write to you, if that would be welcome." Grace felt warmth spread through her chest. "I'd like that very much." "Good," he smiled. "Because I've grown quite accustomed to our conversations. I'd hate to go without them for too long." The following day, Martha Henderson and her daughters made an unexpected visit to the ranch. Grace was in the vegetable garden when they arrived, harvesting the last of the season's tomatoes. "Grace, dear," Martha called, picking her way carefully across the yard in her town shoes. "We were just passing by and thought we'd stop for a visit." Grace wiped her hands on her apron. "Mrs. Henderson, Beatrice, Catherine, this is a surprise. Is it?" Martha's smile didn't reach her eyes. "We've hardly seen you in town lately. Some were beginning to wonder if you were unwell." "I've been busy with the ranch," Grace replied. "Please, come inside. I'll make some tea." In the kitchen, Grace set about preparing refreshments while Martha settled herself at the table, removing her gloves with deliberate precision. "We saw Mr. Galloway in town yesterday," Martha said casually. "Such a distinguished gentleman. Sheriff Miller says he comes from a good family in Colorado." Grace kept her expression neutral as she set cups on the table. "Yes, his father was a cavalry officer who later raised horses. How interesting that he spends so much time here," Martha continued. "One might almost think he had a particular interest in the Donovan ranch." "He's investigating cattle rustling in the territory," Grace explained, though she knew perfectly well what Martha was implying. Of course. Martha exchanged glances with her daughters. Though a man in his position must be thinking of settling down soon. "Beatrice, didn't you find him quite charming at the church social on Sunday?" Beatrice nodded, a practiced blush coloring her cheeks. "He was very attentive when I played the piano. He requested 2 songs specifically." Grace felt a small twist of something unpleasant in her stomach. She hadn't known Preston had attended the social, though why should she? He was free to go where he pleased and speak to whom he wished. "I believe he mentioned he'd be in Cheyenne soon," Martha continued. "Beatrice, didn't your aunt invite you to visit her there next month?" "Yes, Mother," Beatrice replied dutifully. She said the governor's reception would be the perfect opportunity to meet eligible gentlemen. Grace set the teapot down with slightly more force than necessary. "How fortunate," she said, striving to keep her voice level. "I'm sure you'll enjoy your visit." Martha's smile was thin as a blade. "It's so important for young women to create opportunities for suitable matches. Not everyone has the Freedom from traditional expectations that you enjoy, Grace. The barb struck its target perfectly. Grace felt the familiar shame rise up, threatening to choke her. I wouldn't call it freedom, she managed to say. No. Martha sipped her tea. Well, I suppose there are compensations for every situation. Though I can't imagine what could compare to the joy of motherhood. My girls are so looking forward to that blessing someday. With the right husband, of course. Grace remained silent, unwilling to give Martha the satisfaction of seeing her pain. After what felt like an eternity, the Hendersons finally departed. Grace stood on the porch watching their buggy disappear down the lane, a hollow feeling spreading through her chest. What if Martha was right? What if Preston had simply been kind to her out of pity, while his true interests lay with women like Beatrice, young, beautiful, and capable of giving a man children? The thought sat like a stone in her stomach. That evening, when Preston arrived for supper, Grace was polite but distant. She answered his questions with short responses and excused herself immediately after the meal, claiming a headache. She was in the barn checking on a pregnant mare when Preston found her an hour later. You disappeared, he said, leaning against the stall door. Your father said you weren't feeling well. Just tired, Grace replied, not meeting his eyes. Preston studied her for a moment. Have I done something to upset you? Grace stroked the mare's neck, gathering her courage. I heard you attended the church social on Sunday. I did, he confirmed. Sheriff Miller suggested it would be a good way to meet more of the townspeople. And did you? Meet people? A few, he said. Though I missed your company. Grace finally looked at him. Beatrice Henderson said you requested songs specifically when she played the piano. Understanding dawned in Preston's eyes. Yes I did. She played well. She's very beautiful, Grace said, hating how small her voice sounded. And accomplished. Grace, Preston said gently. Are you jealous? The directness of his question startled her. That's not. I have no right to be. That's not what I asked. Grace closed her eyes briefly. Mrs. Henderson came to visit today? She made it very clear that Beatrice would be in Cheyenne during your visit. At the governor's reception. Preston sighed, running a hand through his hair. Martha Henderson is determined to see her daughters well married. But her matchmaking efforts are wasted on me. Are they? Grace couldn't help asking. Beatrice is everything a man could want, young, beautiful, from a good family. She can give you children. Is that what you think I want? Any pretty face who can bear children. There was an edge to his voice now. Isn't it what most men want? Preston stepped closer, his expression intense. I'm not most men, Grace. And what I want is standing right in front of me. Grace's breath caught in her throat. You can't mean that. You know what the doctor said about me. I know what one doctor in a frontier town said years ago based on limited medical knowledge. Preston corrected her. But even if he's right, even if you never bear children, it doesn't change how I feel about you. And how is that? Grace whispered, afraid to hope. Preston reached out, his hand gently cupping her cheek. Like I've been searching for you my whole life without knowing it. Like every conversation with you makes me want 100 more. Like I can't imagine riding away from this ranch without knowing when I'll see you again. Grace's heart hammered in her chest. Preston, I leave for Cheyenne tomorrow, he said. But I'll be thinking of you every minute I'm gone. Not Beatrice Henderson. Not any other woman. You, Grace Donovan. Just you. And then he was kissing her, gently at first, then with growing intensity as she responded. His arms encircled her, strong and secure, and Grace felt something unfurl inside her, a flower long dormant suddenly blooming in unexpected warmth. When they finally parted, both breathless, Preston rested his forehead against hers. I'll write to you every day, he promised. And when I return, we have much to discuss about our future if you'll consider having one with me. Grace nodded, unable to speak past the emotion clogging her throat. For the first time in her adult life, she allowed herself to hope that perhaps the future held more possibilities than she'd ever dared imagine. True to his word, Preston wrote faithfully during his absence. His letters arrived every few days, brought by the stagecoach that passed through Whispering Pines on its way to and from Cheyenne. Each one contained observations about the territorial capital, anecdotes about the people he met, and always, unfailingly, expressions of how deeply he missed her. Grace treasured each letter, reading them repeatedly until the paper grew soft at the creases. She wrote back just as faithfully, pouring her heart onto the pages in a way she'd never done before. 2 weeks stretched into 3, and then 4. Preston's letters explained the delay. The governor had assigned him additional responsibilities investigating a large rustling operation that spanned multiple territories. The waiting was difficult, but Grace found herself filled with a new sense of purpose. She began researching the specialist Dr. Simmons had mentioned, even writing to him directly with questions about his methods. One morning in late October, Grace was working in the ranch office, updating the breeding records, when she heard a commotion outside. Looking through the window, she saw Preston dismounting from his horse, dusty from the trail, but unmistakably him. She ran outside, propriety forgotten in her joy. Preston saw her coming and opened his arms just in time to catch her as she flew into his embrace. "You're back," she breathed, hardly caring who might see them. "I'm back," he confirmed, holding her tightly. "And I've missed you more than words can say." Over supper that evening, Preston shared news of his trip with Grace and her family. The governor had put him in charge of a special task force to combat the rustling problem, which meant he would be based in Whispering Pines for the foreseeable future. "The sheriff has offered me the use of the old deputy's cabin," he explained. "It needs some work, but it's sound." "Nonsense," Grace's father interrupted. "You'll stay with us until you get settled. We've plenty of room, and Grace would skin me alive if I let you live in that drafty old shack as winter's coming on." Preston smiled at Grace across the table. "I wouldn't want to impose." "It's no imposition," she assured him, her heart lighter than it had been in weeks. Later, they walked together under a canopy of stars, their breath forming small clouds in the chilly evening air. "I have something to ask you," Preston said, stopping near the old oak tree that stood sentinel at the edge of the ranch yard. Grace looked up at him, her heart suddenly racing. "Yes." Preston took both her hands in his. "These past weeks away from you have only confirmed what I already knew. I love you, Grace Donovan. Your intelligence, your strength, your kind heart, everything about you calls to me in a way I've never experienced before." He dropped to one knee, still holding her hands. "I know it hasn't been long, but when something is right, you feel it in your bones. I want to build a life with you, whether that includes children or not doesn't matter to me. You are enough, more than enough. Will you marry me?" Tears filled Grace's eyes. "Are you certain? Truly certain? Because if you ever regretted, I will never regret choosing you," he interrupted firmly. "Never. I love you exactly as you are." "Then yes," Grace whispered, joy spreading through her like sunrise. "Yes, I'll marry you." Preston stood and pulled her into his arms, kissing her with such tenderness that fresh tears spilled down her cheeks. "I have something else to tell you," he said when they finally parted. "While I was in Cheyenne, I spoke with a woman doctor, actually. Dr. Elizabeth Marshall, trained in Philadelphia and recently moved to Wyoming territory." Grace looked at him in surprise. "A woman doctor?" Preston nodded. "She specializes in women's health." "I mentioned your situation only in general terms," he added hastily. "She said that tilted wombs are quite common and don't necessarily prevent conception. She also said that injuries can heal over time." Hope flickered in Grace's chest, though she tried to temper it. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying that Dr. Marshall would be willing to examine you if you wanted a second opinion. She'll be traveling through Whispering Pines next month on her way to a medical conference." He squeezed her hands. "It's entirely your choice. I'll love you the same either way." Grace took a deep breath. "I'd like to meet her. Not because I need children to feel complete, you've helped me see that I don't, but because I'd like to know the truth of my own body." Preston smiled, pulling her close again. "That's my brave Grace." News of their engagement spread quickly through Whispering Pines. Most people offered sincere congratulations, though Martha Henderson made a point of expressing concern about their hasty decision and reminding everyone within earshot of Grace's unfortunate condition. Dr. Elizabeth Marshall arrived in Whispering Pines on a crisp November afternoon. She was younger than Grace had expected, perhaps in her mid-30s, with intelligent eyes and a no-nonsense manner that immediately put Grace at ease. "Mr. Galloway spoke very highly of you, Dr. Marshall said as she set up her examination tools in Grace's bedroom. "He's quite smitten." Grace smiled. "The feeling is mutual." The doctor's examination was thorough but gentle, her approach professional, yet kind worlds apart from Dr. Simmons's brusque, dismissive manner years ago. "You do have a slight tilt to your uterus," Dr. Marshall confirmed when she'd finished. "But it's within the normal range of variation. Many women with similar anatomy conceive without difficulty." Grace stared at her. "But Dr. Simmons said Dr. Simmons, like many male physicians, has limited understanding of the complexities of female anatomy," Dr. Marshall interrupted gently. "The fall you experienced may have caused temporary damage that has since healed. Without examining you then, I can't say for certain, but I see no physical reason why you couldn't conceive." "Are you saying I'm normal?" Grace could hardly believe what she was hearing. Dr. Marshall smiled. "Perfectly normal. Of course, nature offers no guarantees. Some couples conceive easily, others take time, and some never do despite having no identifiable problems. But there's no reason to believe you're incapable of bearing children." Grace felt dizzy with the implications. For years, she'd built her identity around the certainty of her barrenness, had accepted the pitying glances and cruel whispers as her due. To think it might all have been based on a mistaken diagnosis. "Thank you, doctor," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "You have no idea what this means." "I think I do," Dr. Marshall replied kindly. "Just remember your worth doesn't depend on your ability to bear children. That's something men created to control women. You are valuable because you are you." After the doctor left, Grace found Preston waiting anxiously in the parlor. "What did she say?" he asked, rising to meet her. Grace told him everything, watching his face as understanding dawned. "So there's a chance?" he asked, hope evident in his voice. "A chance," Grace confirmed. "Not a certainty, but a chance." Preston pulled her into his arms. "That's wonderful news. But remember what I said, it changes nothing about how I feel about you." "I know," Grace whispered against his chest, "but it changes how I feel about myself." They were married on Christmas Day, 1876, in the small church in Whispering Pines. Despite the winter weather, the building was packed with well-wishers, ranchers, and cowboys who respected Thomas Donovan, townspeople who had known Grace all her life, and even Martha Henderson, whose pinched expression couldn't quite hide her envy as Preston gazed adoringly at his bride. Grace wore a simple dress of ivory satin with lace her mother had preserved for her wedding day. Her brothers had pooled their money to buy her a pearl necklace, and Preston's gift, a pair of sapphire earrings that matched his eyes, completed her ensemble. "You are the most beautiful woman I've ever seen," Preston whispered as they said their vows. "Even plain as I am," Grace couldn't help asking, years of insecurity surfacing even on this happiest of days. "There is nothing plain about you," he replied firmly. "You shine brighter than any star in the Wyoming sky." They moved into the deputy's cabin, which Preston had spent weeks renovating with help from Grace's brothers. It was small but snug, with new windows to keep out the winter drafts and a stone fireplace that heated the entire space. Grace filled it with touches of home, her mother's quilts, books they both loved, and her own sketches framed on the walls. Preston's work with the rustling task force kept him busy, but he was never gone for more than a day or two at a time. Grace continued helping with her father's ranch while also creating a home with Preston. Their evenings were filled with conversation, laughter, and a deepening love that sometimes left Grace breathless with its intensity. Spring came to Wyoming territory in fits and starts, warm days followed by sudden snowstorms, then gradual awakening as the prairie bloomed with wildflowers. Grace found herself tiring easily, her appetite changing in strange ways. At first, she attributed it to the busy lambing season, but when she missed her monthly cycle for the second time, a different possibility occurred to her. She said nothing to Preston, not wanting to raise hopes that might be dashed. But when Dr. Marshall passed through town again in late April, Grace sought her out privately. The doctor's examination confirmed what Grace had begun to suspect. "You're approximately 3 months along," Dr. Marshall told her with a smile. "The baby should arrive in late October or early November." Grace could hardly believe it. After years of believing it impossible, the miracle of life was growing inside her. She waited until that evening, when she and Preston were alone in their cabin, to share the news. "I have something to tell you," she said as they sat before the fire. Preston looked up from his book. "What is it, love?" Grace took his hand and placed it gently on her still flat stomach. "We're going to have a baby." For a moment, Preston simply stared at her, his expression blank with shock. Then joy spread across his face like sunrise. A baby? You're certain? Grace nodded, tears of happiness filling her eyes. Dr. Marshall confirmed it today. We're going to be parents, Preston. He pulled her into his arms, laughing and crying at once. Oh, Grace. My wonderful, amazing Grace. I've never been happier in my life. Even though you said children didn't matter to you, she teased gently. They don't, not in the way of making you complete or valuable, he clarified. But the thought of a child who is part you and part me. He shook his head, overcome. It's a blessing I never dared hope for. Word of Grace's pregnancy spread through Whispering Pines like wildfire. Most people offered genuine congratulations, though some like Martha Henderson couldn't resist commenting on the unexpected miracle with barely concealed skepticism. Some women will try anything to hold on to a husband, Martha was overheard saying at the general store. Let's see if this miracle actually results in a healthy child. But Grace refused to let such pettiness dim her joy. Her body changed gradually, her belly rounding with new life. Preston was endlessly fascinated by the process, his hand often resting on her growing stomach to feel the baby's movements. He's strong, Preston said one night as they lay in bed, the baby kicking vigorously against his palm. Or she, Grace reminded him. Either way, this child is determined to make its presence known. Just like its mother. Preston smiled, kissing her tenderly. Summer passed in a haze of preparation. Preston built a cradle from polished pine, while Grace sewed tiny garments from soft flannel. Her father and brothers expanded the cabin, adding a proper nursery and a larger kitchen where Grace could continue her passion for baking. As autumn approached, bringing cooler temperatures to the Wyoming prairie, Grace's time grew near. Dr. Marshall had arranged to be in Whispering Pines for the birth, staying with the sheriff's family while she waited for Grace's labor to begin. It started on a clear October morning, the pain waking Grace from a sound sleep. Preston, she whispered, touching his shoulder. It's time. The next hours passed in a blur of pain and determination. Preston refused to leave her side, despite the tradition that men should wait elsewhere during childbirth. He held her hand, wiped her brow, and whispered encouragement as she labored to bring their child into the world. I can see the head, Dr. Marshall announced finally. One more push, Grace. You're doing wonderfully. With a cry that was part pain and part triumph, Grace gave that final push. A moment later, a different cry filled the room, the indignant wail of a newborn taking its first breath. A daughter, Dr. Marshall announced, placing the tiny, squirming infant on Grace's chest. A beautiful, perfect daughter. Grace looked down at the red-faced, dark-haired miracle in her arms, overwhelmed by a love so powerful it seemed to radiate from her very core. Hello, little one, she whispered. We've been waiting for you. Preston's face was streaked with tears as he gazed at his wife and daughter. She's perfect, he said, his voice thick with emotion. Just like her mother. They named her Emma Hope Galloway, Emma for Preston's mother, and hope for the feeling that had sustained them through their journey together. News of Emma's birth spread quickly through town. Grace's father and brothers were the first visitors, their tough exteriors melting at the sight of the tiny girl with Preston's blue eyes and what promised to be Grace's determined chin. Even Martha Henderson came, her daughters in tow. She's quite lovely, Martha admitted, seeming genuinely surprised. Congratulations to you both. As the visitors departed, leaving the new family in peace, Grace nursed her daughter before the fire while Preston watched them with undisguised adoration. What are you thinking? Grace asked, noticing his thoughtful expression. That I'm the luckiest man alive, he replied simply. And that all those people who mocked you as plain and barren were blind fools who couldn't see the extraordinary woman right in front of them. Grace smiled down at Emma, now sleeping contentedly in her arms. Their opinions don't matter anymore. They never did, really. I just needed to believe in myself. And I'll spend the rest of my life making sure you never forget how remarkable you are. Preston promised, joining them by the fire and gently tracing Emma's tiny features with his finger. Both of my amazing girls. 2 years later, Grace gave birth to twins, a boy and a girl they named Thomas James and Sarah Elizabeth. The cabin expanded again to accommodate their growing family, and Preston's success with the territorial law enforcement led to a promotion that allowed them to purchase land adjoining the Donovan ranch. On Emma's 5th birthday, as they watched their children playing in the yard of the home they'd built together, Preston wrapped his arms around Grace from behind. "Do you ever think about how different our lives might have been if I hadn't come to that dinner at your father's house?" he asked. Grace leaned back against his chest, watching as Emma, now a spirited 5-year-old with her father's charm and her mother's determination, helped her younger siblings build a fort from sticks and blankets. "Sometimes," she admitted. "But then I remember what my mother used to say, that life takes us exactly where we're meant to be, even when the path seems unclear." Preston kissed the top of her head. "Your mother was a wise woman. I wish I could have known her." "She would have loved you," Grace said with certainty. "Almost as much as I do." "And how much is that?" he teased, a familiar game between them. Grace turned in his arms, rising on tiptoe to kiss him properly. "More than all the stars in the Wyoming sky. More than all the cattle on the open range." More than Preston's laugh cut her off as he swept her into a deeper kiss. "I get the idea, Mrs. Galloway, and I love you just as much." As the sun set over the rolling hills of their ranch, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, Grace reflected on the journey that had brought her here from a woman believed barren and plain, mocked for what she lacked, to a wife and mother whose cup overflowed with blessings. But most precious of all was the knowledge that she had always been enough, just as she was. Preston had seen it first, but now she knew it too, and that certainty, that unshakable sense of her own worth, was perhaps the greatest miracle of all. Emma called from the yard, waving excitedly. "Mama, Papa, come see what we made." Hand in hand, Grace and Preston walked toward their children, toward the future they had built together, a future fuller and more beautiful than either had dared to dream.